If you've been following along with this tutorial series and mastered all the content within, then you've made some excellent progress, but you may have been wondering how to play notes that are outside the scale that your flute is tuned to. Well, today will be all about exactly that and the true techniques that allow you to play outside your flute's key without a mechanism. Every flute is tuned to a particular key, which means that as you raise your finger to play the standard notes of that flute, you'll end up playing the scale that that flute is tuned to. For example, this flute in G plays the G major scale, this one plays the D major scale, and this Bem flute plays the C major scale. This is because every hole in the flute is tuned to play a particular note. That said, there are many times where you want to play notes that are outside the scale that your flute is tuned to. For example, if you wanted to play in a different key, or if you wanted to play a song that has notes that go outside the key that it's in. But how do we play these notes? Well, some flutes have mechanisms that allow you to play notes outside of the scale that they're tuned to. Bem flutes being an obvious example, and simple system flutes being another one. These flutes have more holes specifically tuned to play these extra notes. But instead of covering them with a finger, they use a mechanical key, allowing you to play all of the notes without resorting to wacky or overly complicated fingering systems. However, most folk flutes don't have any keys or only have a few. So how do we get the rest of the notes? The answer is with two techniques, cross-fingering and half-holing. Half-holing is very straightforward to understand. You have a note which is in between two holes that you have. You can't play it just by covering the holes completely, so you instead cover only part of the hole, which allows us to go in between the two holes and play the note that we're after. Simple! What you're doing here is effectively making the hole smaller by only covering a portion of it. In fact, if you've ever seen recorders or other instruments with two small holes next to each other, this is in fact a kind of half-hole assistant. By raising your finger off of one of these small holes, you're able to go in between and therefore play the note that's in between. Now, theoretically, half-holing should work on all holes, but in practice, it's not quite so straightforward. For example, half-holing can be very tricky on flutes with very small holes. This isn't just hard because it's difficult to precisely cover a small hole, but also because making the hole even smaller like this results in it potentially not venting enough air and making the note very unstable. As a result, half-holed notes tend to be much quieter and less powerful, and in the worst case scenario, can be extremely difficult to get out or even completely impossible. This said, however, half-hole notes tend to be more effective in the second octave, both easier to get out and a little more powerful. So what about our other option? Cross-fingering is a little more complicated to understand, but not incredibly so. Similar to half-holing, we want to go a half step down from this note. However, instead of doing so by covering a portion of the hole below, we instead skip that note and cover the ones underneath. By doing so, we lower the pitch of the note. The more holes we cover lower down, the lower the pitch is, and the less holes we cover, the higher the pitch is. Cross-fingering can be different on every flute because different flutes have different sized holes, and different sized holes will require different number of holes underneath to be covered or uncovered. As such, you'll probably need to do a little experimenting on your own flute. Now, while that sounds complicated and requires a lot of trial, error, and memorization, cross-fingering can result in more powerful notes and is much easier to play consistently and also more quickly. So it's worth putting some effort into learning how your particular flute works. As a general rule, half-holing is more effective on flutes with larger holes, and cross-fingering is more effective on flutes with smaller holes. However, realistically, regardless of the flute you have, it's a good idea to try and play around with both. Combining them in some way is almost always the best approach. When you look at fingering charts, cross-fingering and half-holing are often used in combination. For example, here's the fingering chart to one of my passion flutes. You can think of the fingering chart as the flute maker or flute manufacturer's opinion on what fingerings are ultimately best for your flute. But it's not strictly necessary to treat these fingerings as set in stone. They should, however, be viewed as an informed guide. As an example of how these fingerings aren't necessarily set in stone, my own fingering charts have a small list of alternate fingerings with a little arrow showing whether they're higher or lower in pitch than the standard fingerings. That said, I'd recommend sticking with the standard fingerings given to you with your flute at least until you notice something off that you want to fix. But let's say you don't have a fingering chart that shows you notes outside of the key, or you're wanting to experiment to find fingerings that are more in tune or more comfortable. How do we do that? Well, when in doubt, try half-holing. For the lowest notes on the flute, half-holing is the only option available. But when you're unsatisfied with half-holing for its tone or compass and playing style, try figure out cross-fingering. Get out a tuner and play the note above what you're wanting to play. For example, say we wanted to play B flat on the C flute. We'll play B, the note above B flat, and make sure that it's in tune. Once you're satisfied that your note is in tune, while playing that note, skip the hole immediately below and cover the next one. Measure the pitch. If the note is too sharp, cover the next hole along. If the note is still too sharp, then try covering another hole again. Keep continuing to cover holes below until the note gets too flat. You'll be very unlikely to get the note perfectly in tune. So instead, compare the fingering of the note that's slightly too sharp and the one that's slightly too flat and see which one is better. To give you a target, if you're able to get within 10 cents of the note on the tuner, that's extremely accurate. If you're able to get within 20 cents, that's still pretty good. However, some people, especially musicians, may be able to tell that's out of tune, so you'll probably want to correct it a little bit with lipping. 30 cents is perhaps a bit far and a lot to correct with lipping. So that's your target. See if you can get within 20 cents and start practicing your new fingering with some music. One thing to mention is that when using this technique, it's very easy to accidentally find harmonic support fingerings, especially in the second octave. Harmonic support fingerings are the fingerings that force the flute to play a different note than expected. We've actually been using one since we started learning our very first octave. This fingering, which forces the flute to play the second harmonic, making the note sound an octave higher than we would be expecting. These fingerings are a little bit like playing harmonics on a guitar, where pressing down a certain part of the string will force out a note which is a harmonic of the note that the string is tuned to. These fingerings are everywhere. For example, the fingering that I just figured out allows me to play B flat on this C flute actually only works in the first octave. If we try and play it in the second octave, it becomes a harmonic support fingering and results in us playing a completely different note than we were expecting. As a result, we have to either half-hole this note or use a different cross fingering. There are many of these fingerings, especially in the second octave, so if your flute suddenly plays a note that you weren't expecting it to, you now know why. If all of that was a bit too much, then stick with your fingering chart for now and come back to this a little bit later. Or if your flute's fingering chart doesn't show notes that are outside of its standard scale, try half-holing or even taking another flute's fingering chart and experimenting with that. The fingering charts for my ceramic flutes are available on the Passion Flute website. If you have a 6-hole flute or a similar folk flute, they may just work for you, or at least get you a bit closer. With any luck, you'll be playing sharps and flats in no time.